Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Welcome to the Abracast. I'm your host, John Towers. We're going to be continuing our look at the Federal Reserve using this book called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Second look at the Federal Reserve. The reason that we are doing this book is because we're gaining insight into the Federal Reserve and inflation and what is happening to us right now, and at least one of the reasons why it is happening to us. So we started hearing about inflation and stuff, and I'm like, yeah, I know what inflation is. Motherfucker, I know what inflation is. And then I realized I know what it is. I don't know why it is. So we started reading this book, and I think that this is going to be the 9th episode dedicated to it. And it is coming to an end rather quickly. I think we got 1 or 2 more episodes before it'll be done. So if you're learning a lot like I am, then stay tuned. More to follow. And if you're not enjoying these episodes, just hang tight. We'll be out of them. We'll be out of them shortly. And we're another thing is we're not doing cover to cover. This isn't like normally how we do our show. So because this book is still not, it's still not in public domain, we're doing selected readings through them instead of cover to cover. I try to mention that because it's different than our standard operating procedure. So I don't want to cause anyone any kind of anxiety or explain the difference, at least for sure. So what else? There's something else I got to do before I get started. Oh, haha. I have with me here my vessel of the art. You can check it out at Abracast.com. And in the vessel of the art is my formula for my weapon of mass distraction, the Jinn Jihad, the mother's milk, the ambrosia, I don't know, the drink of the gods. Chapter 21. Competition is a sin. The story of how New York investment bankers formed a cartel to avoid competition, the drafting of a proposed legislation to legalize that cartel, and the strategy to camouflage the true nature of the legislation, the failure of the deception, and the defeat of the bill. We have traveled to many points in a large circle of time, and now we're approaching the journey to Jekyll Island where the book began. In the last chapter, we saw how the expansion and contraction of the money supply during the Civil War led to a series of booms and busts, and we saw how the firm of J.P. Morgan and Company, with the help of financiers in London, was able to reap great profits from both sides of those cycles, but particularly from the recessions. At that point, we jumped ahead in time to examine how J.P. Morgan and other leading American financiers were closely aligned with British interests. We also saw how in the 1920s the American dollar was deliberately weakened by Morgan agents within the Federal Reserve in order to prop up the sagging British economy. Let us return now to the point of departure and allow our cast to resume playing out the most important prior scene, the actual creation of the Federal Reserve System itself. Historians seeking to justify governmental controls of the monetary system have claimed that the booms and busts occurred during this period were a result of free and competitive banking. As we have seen, however, these destructive cycles were the direct result of the creation and the extinguishing of fiat money through a system of federally chartered national banks, dominated by a handful of firms on Wall Street, which constituted a halfway house to central banking. None of these banks were truly free of state control, nor were they competitive in the traditional sense of the word. They were, in fact, subsidized by the government and had many monopolistic privileges from the perspective of bankers on Wall Street. However, there was a great deal more to be desired. For one thing, America still did not have a lender of last resort. That is banker language for a full-blown central bank with the power to create unlimited amounts of fiat money, which can be rushed to the aid of an individual bank that is under siege by depositors wanting their money back. Having a lender of last resort is the only way a bank can create money out of nothing and still be protected from a potential run by its customers. In other words, it is the means by which the public is forced to pay the hidden tax of inflation to cover the shortfall of fractional reserve banking. That is why the so-called virtue of a lender of last resort is taught with great reverence today in virtually all academic institutions. Offering degrees in banking and finance, it is one of the means by which the system perpetuates itself. The banks could now inflate more radically and more in unison than before the war, but when they pushed too far, too fast, the bank-generated booms still collapsed into recessions. Look out your window. This is happening right now. While this could be highly profitable to the banks, was also precarious. As the American economy expanded in size, the magnitude of the booms and busts increased also, and it was becoming more and more difficult for firms like Morgan and Company to safely ride out the storm. There was a growing dread that the next collapse might be more than even they could handle. In addition to these concerns was the fact that many state banks, mostly developing southern and western states, had elected not to join the national banking system and consequently had escaped the control by Wall Street Washington access. Controlled by the Washington Wall Street access. Escape control by the Wall Street Washington access as the population expanded south and westward. Much of the nation's banking moved likewise, and the new banks were becoming an increasing source of competition to the New York power center. By 1896, the number of additional banks had grown to 61%, and they had already held 54% of the country's total banking deposits. By 1913, the year in which the Federal Reserve was passed, those numbers had swelled to 71%, non-national banks holding 57% of the nation's deposits. Something had to be done to stop this movement. Additional competition was developing from the trend in industry to finance itself from profits rather than borrowed capital. Between 1900 and 1910, 70% of the American corporate growth was funded internally, making industry increasingly independent from the banks. What the bankers wanted was that many businessmen wanted also was a more flexible or elastic money supply, which would allow them to create enough of it at any point in time so as to be able to drive interest rates downwards at will. What would make our loan businessmen what would make our loans to businessmen so attractive, they would have little choice but to return to the banker's stable. Trusting cartels replace competition. We talked about this, I believe, at the first one of these episodes when they were talking about the most sinister duck hunt in history, where this guy Edward Griffin was talking about what a cartel is. It's a group that it's like a conspiracy. They agree to work as one as to mitigate the damage of competition. I think we'll get into this a little bit more here. One more problem facing Wall Street was the fact that the biggest investment houses, such as Morgan and Company and Kuhn Loeb and Company, although they remained as competitors, were at this time so large they had ceased doing serious battle against each other. The concept of trusts and cartels had dawned in America. And to those who already had made it to the top, joint ventures, market sharing, price fixing, and mergers were far more profitable than free enterprise competition. Ron Chernow explains, Wall Street was snowballing into one big Morgan-dominated institution. In 1909, Pierpont had brought a majority stake in the Equitable Life Assurance Society from Thomas Fortune Ryan. This gave him a strong influence over America's three biggest insurance companies, Mutual Life, Equitable, and New York Life. His bankers' trust had taken over three other banks in 1909 and had gained control of Guarantee Trust, which through a series of mergers had converted into America's largest trust. The company, the core money trust group, included J.P. Morgan and Company, First National Bank, and National City Bank. Wall Street bankers incestuously swapped seats on each other's boards. Some banks had so many overlapping directors it was hard to separate them. The banks also shared one large equity stake in each other. Why didn't banks just merge instead of carrying on this charade of swapping shares and board members? Most were private partnerships or closely held banks and could have done so. The answer harkened back to a traditional American antipathy against centralized financial power. Joke. This is a joke. The Morgan First National City trio feared public retribution. If it openly declared its allegiance, interlocking directorates and other forms of hidden control were far more safe than open consolidation, but they too had their limitations. For one thing, they could not penetrate the barriers of similar competitive groupings. As these combines became larger and larger, ways were sought to bring them together at the top rather than to capture the corporate entities which comprised them. Thus was born the concept of a cartel, a community of interests among businessmen in the same field, a mechanism for coming together as partners at a high level and to reduce or eliminate altogether the harsh necessity of competition. All cartels, however, have internal self-destruct mechanisms. Sooner or later, one of the members inevitably becomes dissatisfied with the agreed-upon piece of the pie, and he decides to compete once again and seeks a greater share of the market. It was quickly recognized that the only way to prevent this from happening was to use the police power of the government to enforce the cartel agreement. The procedure called for the passage of laws disguised as measures to protect the consumer, but which actually worked to ensure the elimination of competition. By Henry P. Davison, who was a Morgan partner, put it bluntly when he told the Congressional Committee in 1912, quote, I would rather have regulation and control than free competition, unquote. John D. Rockefeller, even more to the point in one of his often repeated comments, quote, competition is a sin, unquote. This trend was not unique to the banking industry. Ron Paul and Louis Lehrman provided the historical perspective. After 1896 and 1900, then, America entered the progressive and predominantly Republican era, compulsory cartelization in the name of progressivism. Dun, 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 began to invade every aspect of American economic life. The railroads had begun the parade with the formation of the ICC in the 1880s, but now field after field was being centralized and cartelized in the name of efficiency and stability and progress and general welfare. In particular, various big business groups led by the J.P. Morgan interest often gather in the National Civic Federation and other think tanks that pressure organizations saw the voluntary cartels as industrial merger movements of the late 1890s had failed to achieve monopoly prices in industry. Therefore, they decided to turn the government, state and federal, to curb the winds of competition and to establish forms of compulsory cartels in the name, of course, of curbing big business monopoly and advancing the general welfare. So I'm just going to stop here because my brain is kind of making me think of stuff. The first is that this bit here, over this way, about I would rather have regulation and control than free competition. That's like such a weird statement, right? But then if you think about it, this kind of stuff is happening today. You know, you have like Facebook and Twitter, when they get threatened or people speculate that they're actually publishers instead of platforms and stuff, they freak out. They freak out because they become liable for stuff. And they whenever they go in front of Congress for whatever, they always talk about like, yeah, let's get some regulation. Let's get some laws on the books. Regulate us. It's so bizarre. And the other thing is this bit over here about how this stuff is, it happens in the name of efficiency, stability, progress, and general welfare. Like that's happening today too, right? People talk about these ESG scores, and they're doing stuff. They're doing stuff not in the name of making money for their shareholders, but doing the right thing to their stakeholders. We talked about that. We had a couple episodes about this this kind of thing. You can hit up the feature topic link, I think, and find them. I can't remember which episodes they were, but like the ESG scores are real. Like in corporate America, I can tell you firsthand, it's happening. And I think it's happening fast. So those are a couple things that just kind of flashed across my consciousness while I was reading this part. So back to it. The chat, and that's done not in the name of making a profit. They say that it's done for equity. So I might have just blown past that. I know a lot of people might not know what the ESG is. It's a alternate credit scoring system that's based on the decisions that, I guess it's as the decisions that a company makes regarding their environmental policy, in their social policy, and their governmental policy. So, ironically, when Elon Musk was threatening to buy Twitter, they adjusted Tesla's ESG score to where it was like actually below like petroleum companies somehow, because it's that social score. He was threatening to buy Twitter in the name of restoring free speech, and the fucking brakes got locked down on him. Actually, Tesla's stock got hit a little bit. I believe it was because they adjusted this ESG score on him. Anyhow, the challenge no longer was how to overcome one's adversaries, but how to keep new ones from entering the field. When John D. used his enormous profits from Standard Oil to take control of the Chase National Bank, his brother William bought the National City Bank of New York. Wall Street had just one more gladiator in the financial arena. Morgan found that he had no choice but to allow the Rockefellers into the club, but now that they were in, they all agreed that the influx of competitors had to be stopped. And that was to be the hidden purpose of the federal legislation, the government control. Gabriel Kolkol explains the sheer magnitude of many of the mergers culminating in the U.S. Steel soon forced Morgan to modify his stand, though at times he would have preferred total control. More important, by 1898, he could not ignore the massive power of new financial competitors and had to treat them with difference. Standard Oil Company, utilizing National City Bank for its investments, had fixed resources substantially larger than Morgan's. By 1899, was ready to move into the general economy. The test came, of course, in the Northern Securities Battle, which was essentially an expensive draw. Morgan and Standard paid deference to each other, therefore, and mutual toleration among bankers increased sharply. A benign armed neutrality rather than positive affection, as in much a reason as any for the high number of interlocks among the 5 major New York banking houses. Writing in the year 1919 from a perspective of an inside view of Wall Street at the time, John Moody completes the picture. The remarkable welding together of great corporate interests could not, of course, have been accomplished if the masters of capital in Wall Street had not themselves, during the same period, become more closely allied. Yes, he'll be a powerful ally. The rivalry of interest, which was so characteristic during the reorganization period of a few years before, very largely disappeared. Although the two great groups of financiers, represented on the one hand by Morgan and his allies and on the other by Standard Oil forces, were still distinguishable, they were now working in practical harmony on the basis of a sort of mutual community of interests of their own. Thus, the control of capital and credit through banking resources tended to become concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer men. Before long, it could be said, indeed, that the two rival banking groups no longer existed, but it was one vast and harmonious banking power that had taken their place. So he goes on to talk about the Aldrich Vreeland Act, which is the legislation that they were passing to kind of lock guard this cartel. Then they talk about the Jekyll Island plan, which we went through on the first episode. Let's see. I'm just skipping ahead here. All right. Enlisting the help of academia. The speeches and articles by big-name bankers were never intended to sway public at large. They served the function of putting forth the basic arguments and the technical details, which were to be the starting point for the work of others who cannot be accused of having self-serving motives. To carry the message to the voters, it was decided that representatives from the world of academia should be enlisted to provide the necessary aura of respectability and intellectual objectivity. For that purpose, the the banks contributed a sum of $5 million to a special educational fund. Much of that money found its way to the environs of 3 universities, Princeton, Harvard, and the University of Chicago, all of which had been recipients of large endowments from the captains of industry and finance. It was precisely at this time that the study of economics was becoming new and an acceptable field. It was not difficult to find talented but slightly hungry professors who, in return for a grant or a prestigious appointment, were eager to expound the virtues of the Jekyll Island plan. Not only was such academic pursuits financially rewarding, but it provided national recognition from them as pioneers in the new field of economics. Galbraith says, under Aldrich's direction, a score or more of studies of monetary institutions in the United States, and more particularly in other countries, were commissioned from the emergent economic profession. It was at least possible that the reverence for which the Federal Reserve System has been held by economists owes something to the circumstances that so many who pioneered in the profession participated in its new system's birth. The principal accomplishments of the bank's educational fund was to create an organization called the National Citizens League. Although it was entirely financed and controlled by the banks under the personal guidance of Paul Warburg, it presented itself merely as a group of concerned citizens seeking banking reform. The function of the organization was to disseminate hundreds of thousands of educational pamphlets, to organize letter-writing campaigns to congressmen, to supply quotable materials to the news media, and in other ways to create the illusion of grassroots support for the Jekyll Island plan. This is the same playbook. They use this shit still all this time. BLM. Nathaniel Stevenson, in his biography of Nelson Aldrich, says, the League was nonpartisan. It was careful to abstain from emphasizing Senator Aldrich. First and last, hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent by the League in popularizing financial science. This is another thing that, this is another part of their playbook. Take academia, right? The Chinese are doing it right now. The Russians, the commies did it. Get people in academia, get actors. Let's get spicy. The CIA did it with LSD. Get academia to do it. Get celebrities. We need celebrities. Distribute acid to the celebrities. I'm skipping ahead. Wilson and Wall Street. Woodrow Wilson was yet another academic who was brought into the national spotlight as a result of his views on banking reform. It will be recalled from a previous chapter that Wilson's name had been put into nomination for president at the Democratic National Convention, largely because of the influence Colonel Edward Mandell House. But that was in 1912. 10 years prior to that, he was relatively unknown. In 1902, he had been elected as the president of Princeton University, a position he could not have held without the concurrence of the university's benefactors. Among the Wall Street bankers, he was particularly close with Andrew Carnegie, and had become a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation. Two of the most generous donors were Cleveland H. Dodge and Cyrus McCormick, directors of Rockefeller's National City Bank. They were part of the Wall Street elite, in which the Pujo Committee had described as America's Money Trust. Both men had been Wilson's classmates at Princeton University. When Wilson returned to Princeton as a professor in 1890, Dodge and McCormick were, by reasons of their wealth, university trustees, and they took it upon themselves to personally advance his career. Ferdinand Lumberg in America's 60 Families said, For nearly 20 years before his nomination, Woodrow Wilson had moved in the shadow of Wall Street. In 1898, Wilson, his salary unsatisfactory, besieged with offers on many university presidencies, threatened to resign. Dodge and McCormick thereupon constituted themselves his financial guardians and agreed to raise the additional informal stipendium that kept him at Princeton. The contributors to this private fund were Dodge, McCormick, and Moses Taylor Payne, and Percy R. Payne, the family that founded the National City Bank in 1902. The same group arranged Wilson's election as president of the university. A grateful Wilson had spoken in glowing terms about the rise of vast corporations and had praised J.P. Morgan as a great American leader. He also come to the acceptable conclusion about the value of a controlled economy. The old time of individual competition is probably gone by, he said. It may come back, I don't know. It will not come back within our time, I dare say. H. Kinnan tells us the rest of the story. Woodrow Wilson, president of Princeton University, was the first prominent educator to speak in favor of the Aldrich Plan, a gesture which immediately brought him the governorship of New Jersey and later the presidency of the United States. During the Panic of 1907, Wilson declared, "All this trouble could be averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country." So the banking in the period immediately prior to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act was subject to a myriad of controls and regulations, subsidies, and privileges at both federal and state levels. Popular history portrays this period as one of unbridled competition and free banking. It was, in fact, a halfway house to central banking. Wall Street, however, wanted more government participation. The New York bankers particularly wanted a lender of last resort to create unlimited amounts of fiat money for their use. In the event that they were exposed to bank runs or currency drains, they also wanted to force the banks to follow the same inadequate reserve policies so that more cautious ones would not draw down the reserves of the others. An additional objective was to limit the growth of new banks in the South and the West. This is time for growing enchantment with the ideas of trusts and cartels. For those who had already made it to the top, competition was considered chaotic and wasteful. Wall Street was snowballing in the two major banking groups, the Morgans and the Rockefellers, and even they had largely ceased competing with each other in favor of cooperative financial structures. But to keep these cartel combines from flying apart, a means of discipline was needed to force the participants to abide by the agreements. The federal government was brought in as a partner to serve that function. To sell the plan to Congress, the cartel realty had to be hidden in the name, quote, central bank, unquote, had to be avoided. The word federal was chosen to make it sound like a government operation. The word reserve was chosen to make it appear financially sound, and the word system, the first drafts used the word association, but system was chosen to conceal the fact that it was a central bank. The structure of 12 regional institutions was conceived as a further ploy to create the illusion of decentralization, but the mechanism was designed from the beginning to operate as a central bank closely modeled after the Bank of England. The first draft of the Federal Reserve was called the Aldrich Bill, and it was co-sponsored by Congressman Vreeland. But it was not the work of either of these politicians. It was the brainchild of banker Paul Warburg. It was actually written by bankers Frank Vanderlip and Benjamin Strong. Aldrich's name attached to the banking bill was a bad strategy because he was known as a Wall Street senator. His bill was not politically acceptable and was never released from committee. The groundwork had been done, however, The time had arrived to change labels in political parties. The measure would now undergo minor cosmetic surgery and reappear under the sponsorship of a politician whose name would be associated with the public mind with the anti-Wall Street sentiment. The creature swallows Congress. The second attempt to pass this legislation to legalize the banking cartel, the bankers' selection of Woodrow Wilson as presidential candidate, their strategy was to get him elected. The role played by Wilson to promote the cartel's legislation, the final passage of the Federal Reserve Act. The election of 1912 was a textbook example of power, politics, and voter deception. The Republican president, William Howard Taft, was up for re-election. Like most Republicans of that era, his political power was based on the support of big business and banking interests in the industrial regions. He had been elected his first term in the expectation that he would continue the protectionist policies of his predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt, the bull moose, particularly in the expansion of cartel markets for sugar, coffee, and fruit from Latin America. Once in office, however, he grew more restrained in these measures and earned the animosity of many powerful Republicans. The ultimate breach occurred when Taft refused to support the Aldrich Plan. He objected not because he would create a central bank, which would impose government control over the economy, but because he would not offer enough governmental control. He recognized that the Jekyll Island formula would place the bankers into the driver's seat with only nominal participation from the government. He did not object to the ancient partnership between monetary and political scientists. He clearly wanted a greater share for the political side. The bankers were not adverse to negotiating the balance of power, nor were they unwilling to make compromises. But what they really needed at this juncture was a man in the White House who, instead of being lukewarm on the plan, would be counted on to become its champion, and who would use his influence as president to garner support from the fence straddlers in Congress. From that moment forward, Taft was marked for political extinction. This was his period of general prosperity, and Taft was popular with the voters as well as with the rank-and-file party organization. He had easily won the nomination at the Republican convention, and there was little doubt that he could take the presidential election as well. Wilson had been put forth as a Democratic challenger, but his dry personality and aloof mannerisms had failed to arouse sufficient voter interest to make him a serious contender. All right, so there's some politicking here. They split the Republican vote by introducing Roosevelt to run again. This is they did this with Perot in the 90s. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. Then they get into some funny stories about William Jennings Bryan, who I love. One of my favorite drunk histories is the Scopes Monkey Trial episode with William Jennings Bryan. So I'm going to skip ahead here. President Taft, although a Republican spokesman for a big business, refused to champion the Aldrich Bill for a central bank. This marked him for political extinction. The money trust wanted a president who would aggressively promote the bill, and the man selected was Woodrow Wilson, who had already publicly declared his allegiance. Wilson's a fascinating character, by the way. God, to me, he looks like the Count from Sesame Street. But, yeah. Maybe we should do maybe we should do an episode on Woodrow Wilson. We should do one episode on Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's nomination at Democratic National Convention was secured by Colonel House, a close associate of Morgan and Warburg. To make sure that Taft did not win his bid for re-election, the money trust encouraged former Republican President Teddy Theodore Roosevelt, the Bull Moose, to run on the progressive ticket. As a result, as planned, that Roosevelt pulled away Republican support from Taft, and Wilson won the election with less than a majority vote. Wilson and Roosevelt campaigned vigorously against the evils of the money trust, while all along being dependent on the same trust for campaign funding. Typical progressives, both of them. When Wilson was elected, Colonel House literally moved into the White House and became the unseen president of the United States. Under his guidance, the Aldrich Bill was given a cosmetic surgery and emerged as the Glass-Owen Bill. Although sponsored by Democrats in all essential features, it was still the Jekyll Island plan. Aldrich, Vanderlip, and others identified with Wall Street put up a pretense of opposing the Glass-Owen bill to convince Congress and the public that big bankers were fearful of it. The final bill was written with many sound features which were included to make palatable during congressional debate, but which were pre-designed to be dropped in later years. To win the support, the populists under the leadership of William Jennings Bryan, the Jekyll Island team also engineered what appeared to be compromises, but which were actually operations, as Wilson called them, mere shadows while the substance remained. The short Congress was outflanked, outfoxed, and outclassed by a deceptive but brilliant psycho-political attack that resulted in the December 22, 1913, America once again had a central bank. The Great Duck Dinner. How Federal Reserve policies led to the crash of 1929, the expansion of the money supply as means of helping the economy of England, the resulting wave of speculation in stocks and real estate's evidence that the Federal Reserve Board had foreknowledge of the crash. It even executed the events that were designed to trigger it. The story is told of a New England farmer with a small pond in his pasture, and each summer a group of wild ducks would frequent that pond. Try as he would, the farmer could never catch one. No matter how early in the morning he approached, or how carefully he constructed a blind, or of what kind of duck call he tried, somehow those crafty birds sensed the danger and managed to be out of range. Of course, when fall arrived, the ducks headed south, and the farmer, craving for a duck dinner, only intensified. Then he got an idea. Early in the spring, he started scattering corn along the edge of the pond. The ducks like corn, and since it was always there, they soon gave up dipping and foraging for food of their own. After a while, they became used to the farmer and began to trust him. They could see he was their benefactor and now walked close to him with no sense of fear. Life was so easy they forgot how to fly. But that was unimportant because they were now so fat they couldn't have gotten off the water even if they had tried. Fall came and the ducks stayed. Winter came and the pond froze. The farmer built a shelter to keep them warm, and the ducks were happy because they didn't have to fly. And the farmer was especially happy because each week, all winter long, he had a delicious duck dinner. That is the story of America's Great Depression of the 1930s. Skipping ahead here. Booms and busts made worse. The forces of the free market are amazingly flexible. Like the black market, they manage to exert themselves in unexpected ways, in spite of political decree. That they had been the case throughout most of American history. Prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, banking had been coddled and hobbled by government. Banks were chartered by government, protected by government, and regulated by government. They had been forced to serve the political agendas of those in power. Consequently, the landscape was strewn with the tombstones of dead banks which had taken to their graves life savings of their hapless depositors. But these were mostly regional tragedies. They were offset by growth and prosperity in other areas. Even within the communities most severely affected, recovery was swift. Now that the cartel had firm control over the nation's money supply, the pattern began to change. The corrective forces of the free market were more firmly straitjacketed than ever. All banks in the entire country were locked up with each other. What happened in one region is what happened in all regions, and banks were not allowed to die, so there could be no adjustment after their demise. Their illness was sustained and carried like a deadly virus to the others. The expansion of money supply in the 1920s clearly shows that effect. It was not a steady advance, but a series of convulsions. Each cycle was a higher level than the previous one. That is because the bust that followed the booms were not allowed to play themselves out. The monetary scientists now had so many mechanisms at their command, they were able to initiate new expansions to cancel out the downward adjustments. It was like prescribing increasing doses of narcotics to postpone the awareness of an advancing disease. It increases the prestige of the doctors, but it did not bode well for the patients. The roller coaster. Between 1920 and 1929, there were 3 distinct business cycles with several minor ones within them. For the average American, it was confusing and destructive. For the investor, it was a roller coaster ride to oblivion. Up. The Fed had inflated the money supply to pay for World War I. Resulting boom caused prices to rise. Down. In 1920, the Fed raised interest rates to cool off the inflation that caused a recession. The prices tumbled. Farmers were hit the hardest, and hundreds of country banks were closed. Up. In 1921, the Fed lowered the interest rates to stop the recession and to help the governments of Europe. Inflation and expanding debt resulted. Down! In 1923, the Fed tightened credit to put the brakes on inflation. Up! But that was offset by its simultaneous policy of lowering the rate at the discount window, thus encouraging banks to borrow new reserves to expand the money supply. Up! In 1924, the Fed suddenly created $500 million in new money within 1 year. The commercial banks parlayed that into more than $4 billion. And expansion of 8-to-1. The boom that followed took on the character of speculation rather than investment. Prices in the stock market rose drastically. Down! In 1926, the Florida land boom collapsed and the economy began to contract once again. Up! In 1927, Montague Norman of the Bank of England visited the United States to consult with Benjamin Strong. Shortly after his visit, the Fed pumped new money into the system and the boom returned. Down! The spring of 1928, the Fed contracted credit to halt the boom. Up! But the bank shifted their reserves into time deposits. Since the time deposits require a smaller reserve ratio than demand deposits, the banks were able to issue more loans than before. That offset the Fed's contraction of credit. Up! By that time, the British government had consumed its previous subsidy, which was used to maintain its welfare state. In the spring of 1928, the pound sterling was again sagging in the international market, and the gold began to flow back into the United States. Once again, the fledgling creature came to the aid of the Bank of England. Its ailing parent, the Fed, brought a huge volume of bankers' acceptances to depress interest rates and to halt the flow of gold. The money supply suddenly increased by almost $2 billion. Down! In August, the Fed reserved its expansionist policy by selling treasury bonds in the open market and raising interest rates. The money supply began to contract. It was the final bubble. Skipping ahead, the duck dinner begins. The securities market reached its high point on September 19th. Then it began to slide. The public was not yet aware that the end had arrived. The roller coaster had dipped before. Surely it would shoot upwards again. For 5 more weeks, the public bought heavily on the way down. More than 1 million shares were traded during that period. Then, on Thursday, October 24th, like a giant school of fish suddenly turning directions in response to an unseen signal, thousands of... Why didn't they use a duck? Why didn't they use a flock of ducks for that metaphor? That seems like it would, work better. Thousands of investors stampeded to sell. The ticker tape was hopelessly overloaded. Prices tumbled. 13 million shares exchanged hands. Everyone said the bottom had dropped out of the market. They were wrong. 5 days later it did. On Tuesday, October 29th, the exchanges were crushed by an avalanche of selling. At times, there were no buyers at all. By the end of the trading session, over 16 million shares had been dumped, in the most cases at any price that it was offered within a single day. Millions of investors were wiped out. Within a few weeks, further decline. $3 billion of wealth had disappeared within 12 months. $40 billion had vanished. People who had counted their paper profits and thought they were rich were now very poor. The other side of the coin is that for every seller, there was a buyer. The insiders who had moved their investments to cash and their gold were the buyers, but it must be remembered that just because stock prices were falling didn't mean there was anything wrong with the stocks. Those represented solid companies were still paying dividends, and they were good investments at realistic prices. In the panic, prices had tumbled far below their natural levels. Those who had the cash picked up for a small fraction of their true worth. Giant holding companies were formed for that task, such as Marine Midland Corporation, the Lehman Corporation, the Equity Corporation. J.P. Morgan set up food trust standard brands, like the shark swallowing the mackerel. The big speculators devoured the small. There is no evidence that the crash was planned for the purpose of profit-taking. In fact, there is much evidence to show that the monetary scientists tried mightily to avert it, and might have done so had not the higher priority agendas gotten in the way. Yet once they realized the inevitability of collapse in the market, they were not bashful about using their privileged position to take full advantage of it. In that sense, FDR's son-in-law Curtis Dahl was right when he wrote, quote, "It was the calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers," unquote. Congress had been assured that the Federal Reserve Act would decentralize banking power away from Wall Street. However, within a few years of its inception, the system was controlled by the New York Reserve Banks under the leadership of Benjamin Strong, whose name was synonymous with the Wall Street Money Trust. During 9 years before the crash of 1929, the Federal Reserve was responsible for a massive expansion of the money supply. A primary motive for that policy was to assist the government of Great Britain to pay for its socialist programs, which by then had drained its treasury by devaluing the dollar and depressing interest rates in America. Investors would move their money to England, where rates and values were higher. The strategy succeeded in helping Great Britain for a while, but it was set in motion the forces that made the stock market crash inevitable. The money supply expanded throughout this period, but the trend was interspersed with short spasms of contractions, which were the result of attempts to halt the expansion. Each resolve to use the restraint was broken by the higher political agenda for helping governments in Europe In the long view, the result was plentiful money and easy credit as a wave of speculation in the stock market and the urban real estate that intensified with each passing month. There is circumstantial evidence that the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve had concluded a secret meeting in February of 1929 that a collapse in the market was inevitable and that the best action was to let nature take its course. Immediately after that meeting, the financiers sent advisory warnings to list of preferred customers, wealthy industrialists, prominent politicians, and high officials in foreign governments to get out of the stock market. Meanwhile, the American people were being assured that the economy was in sound condition. Time is a flat circle. On August 9th, the Federal Reserve applied the pin to the bubble and increased the bank loan rate and began to sell securities in the open market. Both actions have the effect of reducing the money supply. Rates on brokers' loans jumped 20%. On October 29th, the stock market collapsed. Thousands of investors were wiped out in a single day, and the insiders who were forewarned had converted their stocks into cash while prices were still high. They now became the buyers. Some of the greatest fortunes in America were made in that fashion. All right, guys, so I think that there's one or maybe two more of these things. I'm Dr. John Towers, and this is the Abracast. And today's episode was brought to you by the Inverted Seven of Coins. Check it out on Abracast.com. I'll let Hilla tell you the rest of it.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star
rate and review
wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past. Put your present in context and know your future with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot
cards.
Your body is your temple. So let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult-themed t-shirts.
Occult-themed t-shirts.
Merch, like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive.
The Red Archive.
Access to over 50 hours of archived episodes. More bonus audio. Additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month.
$1 a month.
Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence?
Violence!
Learn more at Abracast.com.
All right, I'm easily amused. That shouldn't surprise any of you.